everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about what is Grimdark and especially what does Grimdark mean to me. Now this is a different type of video, but this is a question that I've had in my mind for such a long time and it has now come back into my mind and I've been thinking about it for a couple of weeks now because I've started reading Malazan. And when I read the first book, Gardens of the Moon, I thought this is Grimdark. And then I read That House Gates. Textbook Grimdark right here. But then I've heard that actually the majority of the fandom, as well as the author, does not view Malazan Book of the Fallen as a Grimdark series. And I was a little bit confused with that. Now, then I went further down the rabbit hole. I went to a couple of forums where they discussed this, and I was even more flabbergasted because people actually said that The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb is a Grimdark series. Now, I would not in a million years think that anybody thinks that The Realm of the Elderlings is a Grimdark series. So I have decided that it's time for me to just share my own views here, and I do hope that all of you who are watching, if you have some views and some arguments to share, and if you hear what I'm about to say and you want to tell me where I'm wrong or where I'm right, definitely let me know in the comments down below, because this is a discussion that I find very important, but I also find so interesting that I just want to hear what everybody thinks about this. Now, I think that Grimdark, first of all, is a very difficult subgenre to define because there are multiple elements. For me, of course, first of all, something that everybody will talk about are the morally grey characters. And of course, this is very important. You can't have a Grimdark novel without morally grey characters, but at the same time, it's a very broad definition. I think that in real life, most people that we meet are morally grey to a lesser or a harder extent. Because you don't have people who 100% of the time make the right decisions. That just doesn't exist. So a lot of stories, a lot of fantasy books that have morally grey characters are not Grimdark. I would say Vin from Mistborn Era 1 is a morally grey character. She has a traumatic past and because of that she makes some very questionable decisions. However, I would never in a million years say that Mistborn Era 1 is a Grimdark series. When we then compare this to Rin in the Poppy War, and I think that Rin, especially in the first book, is very reminiscent and very similar to Vin in Mistborn. Both of them have a traumatic past, both of them are elevated from their original station and are chosen for a very important task, and both of them will do everything in their power to succeed in that task. And they do go to very far extents for that. The difference between these two is the character development and the things that they come across and how that affect them as a person. I think that often in your non-Grimdark fantasy you have what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But then in Grimdark, in comparison, you often have what doesn't kill you can actually break you. And I like that. And I wouldn't say that I want that for all of the characters, but I do like that for some of the characters we do explore what trauma can do to you and how it can actually tear you down, especially if you don't have the help and the support system that you need. And then we get, of course, into the second very important, I think, definition or part of the definition for Grimdark. And that is a very bleak and hopeless world. Often in Grimdark, you have a war that's going on. And that's like the backdrop where your story happens. Or you have a very corrupt political system. And you either see the persons at charge who don't give a damn about the people under their charge. And they just make decisions because they are very selfish. Or you are following the people lower down the ladder and you see how all of those decisions affect them. You see the atrocities of war and you see what happens after an army has passed. Now, like I said, in some traditional fantasy you might have this as well. The Faithful and the Fallen series is a big series where you have one big war. The Lord of the Rings is a series where you have one big war. The difference there is that you have the war between good and evil. And you see how certain things happen in war, but more or less the atrocities are definitely glossed over. But things that happen actually establish some people as heroes. The war is actually almost something that they use, a device that they use to make people bigger and better than what they were before. Something that they couldn't show when the world was not burning down, basically. And that's the difference, I think. And that's then the third part of the definition, is for me that in Grimdark, that's the focus. The focus is the atrocities of war or what's happening, the aftermath of this. The focus is the downfall of some of our main characters and what trauma does to a main character. While in more traditional fantasy or non-Grimdark fantasy, you often have the glossing over of the atrocities and then the focus on the lights of hope and how people become better than what they are and how you can turn trauma around and actually grow from this. And that's always the focus of these books. So I would say that that's actually the biggest part of Grimdark, where the focus lies in comparison to other books. Now, I do think that up until this point, most people would probably agree. The thing that a lot of people disagree about is, can you have hope and humanity in your Grimdark? And for this, I would just briefly touch about your very traditional fantasy for a second, which is, for example, your Rift War cycle by Feist. You, of course, have your Wheel of Time, even though that's a little bit less traditional fantasy than some of the other works that I'm going to discuss right now. You have your Faithful and the Fallen, you have your Lord of the Rings. Now, this is very traditional fantasy, and I must say that this is a subgenre of fantasy that I personally don't enjoy. Now, I've often heard people say, well, if you dislike traditional fantasy, give Grimdark a chance, because that's the complete opposite. And I would say that I highly disagree with that, because if it was the complete opposite, I would have just the same issues with it. What are my issues with traditional fantasy? Well, like I said, you have the good guys, you have the bad guys, and there is not a lot of character development, because both of those groups are already established, and they're not going to change. This is what they are. We have these cardboard characters, which are basically just there to make the plot move forward, and that's it. And because of that, you also know what's going to happen. The good guys are going to win, and the bad guys are going to lose. And yes, maybe some of the good guys are going to die. More often than not, you are going to lose some side characters and not a main character, but sometimes you will lose a main character. And that is always done in the light of, they died for a bigger cause. They died so others could live. And they actually died as heroes. And it almost makes dying a wholesome event. It's always for something bigger to happen. And it's almost like people sacrifice themselves for something. While in Grimdark, even though that sometimes happens, and I do think that sometimes you do need that hope, so here is my answer. Do I think that hope should be in Grimdark? More often than not, it shows you how horrible dying actually is, and how useless that it is, and how people could have lived, but they didn't because of the actions of others. And I actually like that more. It makes it more heartfelt. It makes me, a reader who loves emotional fantasy, who loves fantasy that really can struck a nerve with me, that can really make me feel something, that's just something that's more appealing to me. Now, if you then would take the exact opposite from all of what I just said, you would say, well, when we have traditional fantasy where there is a lot of hope, where we really take the focus on all of the good things that are happening, and when we have a good option or a bad option, the good option is always going to win, and because of that it's predictable, the exact opposite would be, well, there is no hope. And if the worst thing that can happen, imagine, and that's always what's going to happen in this story, then why would I care? Why would I read something like that? Why would I become invested? If I know that my characters are not going to succeed, if I know that they're just going to be the worst version possible of themselves in the end of the book, I'm going to keep them at arm's length. I'm not going to start caring for them, because I would be a fool to do so. And I wouldn't care about the plot, because I know what's going to happen. The story is going to end badly. So no, that's not what I want. I don't want the exact opposite. I want Grimdark that has learned from traditional fantasy, that has seen the same shortcomings that I personally see in traditional fantasy, and that has expanded on that. So no, not everything is going to go the way that we want to. Most of it is not going to go the way that we want to, but some things are. And no, our characters are not beyond redemption. We actually do have some characters that we come to care for, and we actually do have some characters that sometimes do the right thing, and because they sometimes do it, it's so heartbreaking when they sometimes don't. That's what I'm looking for in Grimdark. I want that answer to traditional fantasy and not the complete opposite. And I do think that if you are somebody who says that hope and humanity can be in a Grimdark novel, and I'm not saying that it should be, because there are definitely subgenres of the subgenre of Grimdark that do not have hope and do not have humanity, and that's just as well Grimdark as the ones that do have. But I do think that having hope and having humanity in your story does not immediately make it a non-Grimdark story. And I think if you agree with that most people would also agree with the fact that Malazan can be viewed as Grimdark, and I personally do view it as that. And for me, that also doesn't make it less Grimdark. For me, it actually makes it more so, because when you see the atrocities of war, and when you see people make the wrong decisions, when you see people become a lesser version of themselves, but you know that there is still hope, that makes it all the worse to then read about them not taking that grain of hope and actually choosing the path of darkness, other than when you don't have that. There is just no hope. There is no possibility to do the right thing. That makes it less grim for me. That makes me less connected to the story, and that makes it less heartbreaking. At least that's how I experience it. So Malazan is not grimdark despite having moments of hope. It's one of the best grimdarks that I've read in a long time because it has that. Now, you might now ask me, well, you've just talked about grimdark and you said that, well, you have morally grey characters, but you can also have them in more traditional fantasy. You have a bleak world, and often war is a backdrop that we have, but we can also have this in traditional fantasy. And we have hope and humanity, or at least we can have that. And of course, we also have that in traditional fantasy. Then what is the difference exactly between the two? And I think that this is a very difficult question to answer, and this is why most people can't really find a consensus about what grimdark is. But for me, it depends on where the balance lies. My grimdark, and the books that I view as grimdark, are ones where darkness is taking the overhand. And that's definitely where the focus lies. However, few and far between, you have the snippets of hope. You have that small beam of lightning in a world of darkness. Where more traditional fantasy is, of course, in this case, the exact opposite. Where you actually have a lot of light, and then you have that small beam, that small dark spot. Now, of course, it's not going to be one of these two very extremes. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. And where it goes from non-grimdark to grimdark, where that line lies, that's very difficult to answer. For me, it's just a feeling. For instance, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin doesn't feel as grimdark. I do think that it takes a step away from the traditional fantasy and it answers some of the issues that I have with it. For instance, the villains are much better developed and you understand better how they have become villains, but you still have the clear villains and you still have some of the good guys. And even though I've said in most good books you have morally grey characters, and in A Song of Ice and Fire I think that all characters are morally grey, but the good guys have more or less such a small amount of morally greyness in them that you can still call them the good guys. So it's a very good book because you have that duality and because you have a difficult time trying to distinguish who the good and who the bad guys are, but you can still do it. While as in Malazan, for example, I didn't know who to root for. I was rooting for everybody, but I couldn't say these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, because it was so difficult. And I think that all of the characters that we were following had so much morally grey into them that you could call none of them the good guys. I also think that if we look at Malazan and if we look at some of the definitions that I've used, we have, like I said, morally grey characters, and in the sense and in the extent of it that we can call none of them the good guys, while, for example, in Mistborn Era 1 we can definitely see these are a group of good guys who are fighting against darkness. In Malazan we see the atrocities of war in graphic detail, and we see what it does to some of the characters. We see how they internalize their trauma and then push it out and actually hurt other people, and how trauma is something that can actually affect multiple people, not just the people who are experiencing it themselves, but also because they lash out. And you see some of the most heartbreaking moments in Malazan, in both Gardens of the Moon in my experience, but especially in Dead House Gates. So I would say if that's not grimdark, I don't know what is. Now, we can then go on to authorial intent. Because like I've said, the author, Steven Erikson, has actually said that he doesn't view his own series, Malazan, as a grimdark series. And I don't want to put words in Steven Erikson's mouth, but I have read a paragraph that I, by the way, found very interesting, where he explained his points of view. And especially when you see the author, the person who have actually crafted this work, explain it, that was very insightful. However, it doesn't change my experience as a reader. I think that learning what an author tried to do can be very interesting, but it doesn't change what he actually accomplished in the reader's mind. If Terry Goodkind, for example, tells you that he didn't write fantasy, but he clearly wrote fantasy, does that then change anything? Should we put Terry Goodkind's books in the comedy section? Because that's what he said it was. He didn't say that, by the way, but I just wanted to make a very clear distinction here. If the makers of Friends, the TV show, all of a sudden say that that's a documentary, should we then put it under nonfiction? Or should we just establish that what the author's intention is doesn't really change anything to his work and what he actually did? Now, I'm not saying that anybody's right or wrong here. I'm not saying that Steven Erikson is wrong to call his own work not grimdark. I'm just saying that it doesn't really change my viewpoint. So for me, author's intent never really changes how I, as a reader, see the book, see the TV show, see the movie, or anything like that. I like to read about it. I like it to also think about it more, because Steven Erikson's paragraph actually did make me think about this more and see it from a different point of view as well, but it doesn't change my actual outcome of my feelings. Now, another thing that I actually found a very good question, and this was when with a group of people we were actually discussing Dead House Gates, and some of us thought that this was grimdark, others said it was not. And one of the people who said that it was not grimdark said, well, let me ask you something. Malazan talks about the history of an empire, the history of an entire world. Would you say that our history, our own history in this world, is grimdark? Because we also have war here, and we also have some very dark episodes in our own history. Is that then grimdark? Now, I would say it depends on where you put the focus and which POVs you are following, because there are definitely grimdark moments. And if in your book of this world you would highlight those moments, that would definitely be a grimdark book. But if you highlight the moments of hope and the moments of humanity, and you don't go too deeply into the trauma and the torture and the grittiness, then it's not a grimdark book. So it definitely depends for me where you put the focus. And I would say that even though Malazan has the instances of humanity and they definitely have their moments of hope, it's not the focus. And like I said, it's far from and few in between. And that's what for me makes it one of the best grimdarks that I've read, but still very much grimdark. Now, and when we then go back into the humanity and hope sub-part of this discussion, I can definitely see why people would dislike that in their grimdark and view books that have that as non-grimdark. And I think that we definitely have some grimdark books like The Prince of Nothing by Mark Lawrence, which is the first book in the Broken Empire trilogy, like Beyond Redemption and The Mirror's Truth by, of course, Michael R. Fletcher, where I do think that there's no hope and I don't think that there's that much humanity. And I think that that's definitely a part of grimdark that a lot of people can actually enjoy. I just don't think that that's the only grimdark that's out there. Now, I can definitely respect everybody's opinion on that, but I would then ask you, if you can't have hope and you can't have humanity in your grimdark, what do you think about the First Law trilogy? What do you think about the Chronicle of the Unhewn Throne trilogy? What do you think about Bloodsong, which in my opinion are all very clear grimdark examples, but there's definitely hope. Bloodsong, I would say, is following actually a hero, a guy who tries to do the good thing time and time and time again, but because of the instances and the situations that he finds himself in, he can't always do that. In the Chronicle of the Unhewn Throne trilogy, we follow 3 young people who are full with hope, who want to do the right thing, and they can't wait to do that in the first book. But because of disloyalty, and because of betrayal, and because of distrust among each other and among different people, and because they are not ready for the task at hand, they actually turn into lesser versions of themselves. But still, towards the end and in the different books of that trilogy, you still see them make the right decisions sometimes. And like I said, that's what I love about grimdark, about not knowing what's going to happen and seeing those glimmers of humanity in each of those characters, no matter how despicable they become towards the end. So I would then say, if you don't want hope and humanity in your grimdark, how do you view those? Would you say that First Law is grimdark while Malazan is not? And why? What is the distinction between the two for you? Because I do think that that's a very interesting question to answer. Now, I do think that I've said the most important things that I wanted to mention here. Of course, as soon as I hit the stop button to record, I'm going to think of something else. But for now, I do think that this was everything that I wanted to say. And I do hope that my point of view and how I view grimdark and what I see as grimdark or not as grimdark is more or less obvious from this video. If not, you can of course always ask me something in the description box. In the comments down below. So I do hope that this video was somewhat informative and somewhat interesting to you. I hope that you enjoyed this video and see you next time. Bye!